think this is on. Hey, good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the last seminar of 2025. Woo. All right. First of all, do any faculty have any announcements? I have a few, but does anybody have any other ones to make? Okay. First announcement. The OS 401 poster session is Thursday afternoon. You all got an email about it today. But Thursday afternoon from 1:30 to 3, I hope you, and it's on the second floor passageway of ABS. Super informal. Come through, browse the posters, talk to the researchers, get a sense of what senior research is all about. I hope to see you all there. And you can just, take 5 minutes and do that. Second, for those of you in your various seminar classes, please make sure you fill out the course evaluation for seminar class, because you won't be doing that in class, because this is the last seminar class of the year. So please do that on your own time before Friday. Third announcement, there will be a holiday study break from Ocean Studies next Monday, a week from today, from 12 to 2, making snowflakes. Oh, yep, and that's in Wyman House. The jazz band will be playing. Drop in. There'll be lots of yummy treats and fun crafts and just a nice study break to give your brains a break from getting ready for finals. Okay? I think that's it. Okay. So I have the pleasure of introducing our last seminar speakers of the semester, Ann Segers and Mike Thalhauser, and they're going to be here talking about, as you can see, alewives and stewardship and co-management of alewives and other river herring in the Bagaduce and in the state of Maine. So as many of you know, this is close to my heart too, because I work on these in the Bagaduce as well. But our guests today are, as I said, Ann and Mike. Ann Segers is raised by biologists in the heart of Eastern Maine's conservation community. But she was a little bit of a rebel, and when she went to college, she studied creative writing, and geology. But after graduating in 2016, she returned to her roots, working in Atlantic salmon conservation, first with a river restoration group, Project Share, and then as a field tech for the Maine Department of Marine Resources Bureau of Sea-Run Fisheries. She joined Manomet in April of 2024 as the Sea-Run Fisheries Monitoring Coordinator and is based down in East Machias, so far down east. And she works with a diverse array of partners, including commercial harvesters, NGOs, state, tribal, and federal agencies to track the abundance of sea-run river herring across the region and monitoring the shifting environmental conditions that impact them. And that broad diversity of different stakeholders and partners, you're going to hear that over and over again today, that so many different levels of and groups of folks are involved in this. And then Mike Thalhauser, our other presenter today, is a project manager with Maine Coast Heritage Trust, and before that has worked with Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries out of Stonington. Before he came to Maine, he worked in Alaska for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as an area manager in Anchorage, Prince William Sound, and the North Gulf Coast. He also directed the Kuskokwim Native Fisheries Department in Aniak, Alaska, conducting collaborative research and management in remote fishing villages. Mike graduated in 2005 from the University of North Dakota with a BS in fisheries and lives in Brooklyn with his kiddos. And Mike and I have spent many hours together working on beaver dams and counting fish and measuring fish and all kinds of wonderful things. So spent a good amount of time with Mike in the field. So we're really thrilled to have them here today, and we give them a warm welcome, please.
Yeah. All right, there we go. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everybody. My name is Mike Thalhauser. All right, got that. Okay. Thanks for coming here today. So really appreciate you coming in. Sarah talked a little bit about our titles, stewardship and co-management of river herring in the Bagaduce and in the state of Maine. And I was just kind of chuckling to myself. We could have thrown an and beyond at the end of that too. So we'll go into a little bit about that. So I think really, we're hoping to cover a lot of ground here today. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions, but I'm going to start with a real basic introduction to what these fish are, who we are, and then really focus on some of the local work that Sarah and I have been part of around here and a lot of the communities that you guys live in that really started here around values and purpose and really practical things. And really, I think it's a story to me about how that, along with partners, really grew into a movement that really comes with a lot of momentum and around a really amazing and important fish. So Sarah told you a little bit about me. Here's just some kind of pictures of my background. I went to school we're in a college, so I figured I'd chat a little bit about our careers, but I obviously was a fisheries biologist with MCCF before working at Maine Coast Heritage Trust, where I'm at right now. But when I was in school, I think I took like 1 or 2 classes in fish and was really focused on fish and wildlife. And so I was more straight bird nerd kind of person. But when I got out to Oregon to try to find a job, it was no more spotted owl money and it went the fish way. And it's just one of those things in your career where follow opportunities and things like that, and you never know where you're going to end up with these kind of things. So I'm always happy to answer questions after this around fish stuff, policy stuff, or career stuff. So here's just a few pictures of my field work out in Alaska, tracking fish and doing the fun stuff out there, and then me with my little alewife in the middle there. So just kind of getting to the basics around river herring themselves. So you'll probably hear Ann and I say alewife and river herring, and you'll hear other people say that. So alewife are just one species of river herring, along with shad and blueback herring that have similar life histories, but they're managed really together as a complex. So you'll hear us interchange that. River herring are anadromous fish. I'll talk a little bit about their life history in a second. But they're basically they're kind of backwards from salmon, where instead of spawning as adults up in there and then spending most of their life, they're not backwards. I'm going back to my alewife stuff. But anyway, so they, instead of spawning in rivers up in some of the headwaters like salmon do, alewives swim back to our communities, and they spawn in ponds and lakes before leaving their juveniles. I think I'd go with that to the next slide. So basically, in their life history, adult alewife, when they're mature and ready to spawn, will swim up our streams and rivers in our communities, and will spawn in small to medium to large lakes and ponds. They'll basically spawn. They're not like salmon, where they'll spawn like in little pairs and in groups like that. They'll spawn in big groups, where they do what's called broadcast spawning, where they'll kind of get into a big group of thousands of fish in a pond and spawn in a large group, and their eggs will settle out. And as soon as they spawn and leave their eggs in our ponds and lakes, the adults pretty much boogie and get right back out to the ocean where they once began, or where they came from anyway. And the juveniles will stay in those ponds. They'll hatch out pretty quickly depending on the temperature, and spend that first summer into late summer, early fall, even into late fall, and early winter, before those little baby alewife will swim out into the ocean, and they'll start that life cycle over again. They first start spawning around 3 or 4 years old. They can spawn more than one time, unlike a lot of species of salmon, and they can live to be 9 or 10. I think most of the ones that we kind of top out around 7 or 8 in Maine with most alewife. So a lot like salmon, and in really incredible numbers. There's a lot of hyperbole and great analogies in the state of Maine and in our books and things like that about streams looking black with fish and being able to walk across their backs almost in some of the places they inhabit. And if you haven't been out to one of these places where alewife migrate, you really should try to get out there this spring and see it, because it's a sight to behold. And they do, like a lot of fish, they really that spawn in this way and have this kind of life history. It's really a numbers game. And so because it's a numbers game and you end up with a whole lot of individuals in a population, alewife have been a really big source of commercial fisheries in the state of Maine. And that's been one of the, like every other fish that's good to eat, has been one of the challenges that they've been up against. And this is just a graph showing up to some recent landings in the state of Maine. And this is actually really a drop in the bucket of the entire commercial harvest. Like I said, they're their range, if I didn't say it, is all the way down to Florida and goes up into Canada. And so they cover a really wide range. They, at one point, could have inhabited all the ponds in that range. And so there's a lot of fish. They really were a commercially targeted fish for bait, for food, for all kinds of things. And like I said, this is just state of Maine landings where we're harvesting fish that are adults, mostly coming back to spawn. There's also an even more significant historically fishery in the open ocean that's been alongside other kind of 11, 12-inch silvery fish that are all sort of caught for the same purpose, so the Atlantic herring fishery and things like that they commingle with. As they're doing this commingling and moving back and forth between the ocean environment and the pond environment, alewives, like one really important thing as we talk about their ecological function is where do they sort of fit into the food chain and into that ecosystem. And so alewives eat zooplankton basically from the time they're done using their own egg sac for food to the time they're spawning themselves. They're basically swimming around with their mouths open and collecting zooplankton. And so they're really important in that way as an animal that's taking something that's one step removed from phytoplankton and sun's rays creating it to making that food and protein and fats and all those good things be available to really an entire food chain. And the fact that they move up and down the coast and from fresh water into salt water, they're really important as just a mover of all those nutrients and taking nutrients out, and just they're really a keystone or an umbrella. You can look at it a lot of different ways, species. And on the other side of it, what eats alewives? And so birds eat alewives. Basically, everything around here that you can think of that can fit an alewife will eat an alewife. Beavers don't eat alewives, but we'll get into them a little bit later. But people eat alewives, and they're really good smoked. And so they're, the Passamaquoddy word for an alewife is the fish that feeds all. And they've really remained true to that name, where they're really, their value is in their food, their existence as a food. And so we'll talk, so really the bigger question is what doesn't eat alewives. So now we'll get into, we know a little bit more about sort of where they live, how they move around, and we'll talk a little bit about how they're managed, and that's really where a lot of the local pieces come into play here. So in co-management, and this is what we call a fishery like the river herring fishery, where it's managed not just with one entity, it's the state, and usually a fishery is either the state, making management rules, doing the monitoring, or it's the federal government, and there's jurisdictions that kind of move around in there. And alewives are a really unique species, along with shellfish in the state of Maine. You guys may have heard about shellfish committees in Castine or in other places in Maine. I don't think Castine has one, but alewives and clams are the two species in the state of Maine that are allowed to be locally managed, and that means there's actually rules on the books that towns can form committees and decide, like, this is a fishery that's really important to our town, and we want to take control of what we can around that fishery and be able to manage that. And so in some place, like with clams, that means towns are allowed to create license limits and bag limits if they're more restrictive than the state. And with alewife, it's a little bit vaguer, it's a little bit less defined, but it allows them, if they're able to show that they have a sustainably harvestable population of fish, and we'll talk about what goes into that, they're allowed to actually work with the state to be able to create management plans and talk about what's important to them in their fishery and do some of the management legwork there. So there's different levels of alewife that are part of this co-management sort of system, how they're managed. On one level, they're managed at the federal government. So they're managed on that. You can see that's on the left there, there's their range that's over here. You can see that up and down the coast. And so they're managed at the federal level, and we're going to talk a lot about scales really in this slide, because that's scales in like sort of capacity and what you're able to do at different scales and with your knowledge there. And so if you can imagine if you're thinking about managing a fish species on this scale, you're really limited to just super blunt tools, like really big hammers that can do a big thing and not much other than that. And to be honest, the federal government has not, at least in the recent past. Hasn't been too bad as sort of being in this role. And so with Alewife, a good example of is when we looked at that curve of landings, and we saw that they had a huge decline because of overfishing. We're going to talk about their access to spawning grounds, whether it's a culvert or a dam. But these fish have really had it against themselves, along with salmon and other anadromous fish species. And so around the early to mid 2010s in this fishery, it was long before that, but it really got to a place where we said this fish is in huge trouble. They actually were almost listed as endangered. They just narrowly escaped that. But what the federal government did do was they created a moratorium on commercial fishing for alewife, and so that was one way they were able to use their really blunt tool in, I think it was 2018 or 2019, to be able to say, like, we're going to stop, like, just really actively trying to target these fisheries. They still did get caught quite a bit in some bycatch fisheries, but really where this hit home was the state of Maine was at that time the predominant harvesting state of alewives, and while our commercial fisheries that had existed for these fish that are swimming up our streams, they were able to sort of get grandfathered in, but what it did was it made it very difficult for a new town coming in to potentially harvest their local population. It made it a lot harder, and we'll talk about how that has its positives and kind of negatives. A lot of people think, like, catching fish, it's got to be bad for the fish, but there's some ways of looking at this that kind of muddy those waters. So that's the federal sort of blunt. We can do big things, but not very surgically. And then we get down to the state of Maine, and we can see the different drainages on the left, and now you can sort of see how Janet and her team can get a little bit better of a handle on things that are happening at a finer scale. And so the state has the Department of Marine Resources that do this, and I'm sure you guys in your natural resources classes have talked about, like, the sheer number of miles of coastline that the state of Maine has. So you can imagine that, and I think at least when I left the river herring focused world, it was, 6 or 7 people at the state of Maine that are really have positions that have alewife in their job descriptions. And so if you can imagine trying to monitor fish at this 2,000, whatever mile coastline, you can imagine that's a big ask too, and not one that our state can do. And so then we get down to this local level, and here's Bailey Bowden, who I think talked to this class last year before, but Bailey's the chair of the Alewife Committee. He's also the chair of the Shellfish Committee, and a whole lot wears tons of other hats in town here. And Bailey has been a part of this fishery since he was a kid, and is I think 4th or 5th generation Penobscot resident. And so as we're going down this scale, and Bailey's really the kind of the point person, and as we talk about different towns and their river herring resources, a lot of this revolves around individuals and one or two key people that are really focused and want to play a part in this management. And that's where my organization that I worked for before played a big role of trying to tie these different scales and people and places together. So this is a map of the Bagaduce River drainage. You've got Penobscot, Brooksville, and Sedgwick are the 3 towns that we're working with that have land that's in the drainage there. And these 3 pictures of fish here you'll see are where we had fish when we started this work that I started being part of around 10 years ago. And there's 2 other ponds that I can't remember if it'll pop up, but anyway, these are the places where there were fish before, and at Walker's, at White's, and Pierce's Pond. And then you'll see Frost Pond and Parker Pond also had historically had alewives, but they had been in the recent years extirpated because of some sort of barrier that was in their way. And we'll get back to that. And so that's where my work really started, connecting to this at MCCF. You heard from Sarah that I did work with subsistence fishing villages, and then worked as an area management biologist. And so I had a lot of different kind of angles and perspectives on this co-management. How do people that are government related work with people that are not government work related, that might not be as formally trained, whatever, but to co-manage and to work together towards this sort of gray gold that nobody really has a great handle on. And so I started working with, actually there was only one alewife committee in Penobscot. Sedgwick and Brooksville didn't have committees that were really focused on this. And so just worked with those towns that had this kind of rich cultural history and background with these fish that have lived here as long as people have and a lot longer, and wanted to play a role in that, and so started convening, really started working with Penobscot, and then started working with harvesters and other interested folks like Sarah around Alewife in the area, and we decided as a team to work together as like a 3-town Alewife committee, because these fish, again, a lot of this comes back to scale and what makes it important. And so the 3 towns work together. They each have their own committees that can make specific sort of goals on their own, but the work together is really where it's at. And so this was our work plan really when we started 10 or 11 years ago, to be able to monitor our fish coming back in all the ponds, because that's what's really required to, remember I said you had to prove that you had to have a sustainably harvestable population of fish. That requires 10 years of monitoring, basically. And so that was one of their goals, was to do that monitoring, basically counting their fish coming back, to restore access to all the ponds that have historically had fish, to manage their alewife populations in the Bagaduce, and open a non-commercial harvest back up that was closed at Walker Pond, where they had these fish that were a little bit smaller than any other fish around here. And so they somehow, back in the 70s, got classified as pygmy alewives, which I've got a little slide on later. But it was sort of the good old boy days of fisheries biology, and they're like, oh, these things are smaller, and so they ended up in this weird classification of fish where the state was like, I don't know if we should harvest those. And so they were actually the only place in the state that was closed by state statute. And so that was them taking the town away from really accessing that cultural history of theirs. And so they wanted to be able to, even if it was non-commercial, to be able to harvest and to eat those fish in the spring like they always had. And then really make this all sustainable. Like, how do we keep this going? Because we've had fish before, we've lost fish, we've had fish, and what's it going to take to really make this go forward? So on the monitoring side, basically, like I said, this means like counting fish. And so most of the way we do this in the Bagaduce River is, like I said, these fish are swimming up streams, going into ponds to spawn, and so we're waiting. You can see on the top right there is a picture of someone with a little pitch counter kind of clicker, and we basically split the day out into 4 different periods that are 3-hour blocks each, and then count for a half an hour within each one of those blocks, and then extrapolate that out to an estimate of how many fish we have coming back. And surprisingly, as a fisheries biologist, I came in a little skeptical, and it's still not the best system in the world, but they really do swim back, fairly consistently throughout the day, and I feel like they're at least comparable as really good indexes. So we do sampling, and you can imagine as you're going through this, think about the work that it takes to do this. These fish are swimming back basically for the whole month of May, and you've got to have someone out there on call kind of all day to be counting fish. And then on the bottom right, you can see us, this is Kathy Lineburner in Brooksville, collecting scales from fish. So we collect about 100 scales from each run to be able to we compare then the numbers of fish that we got back to how old they are. And that tells us a lot about how well their just kind of entire system's working. So if we're getting only 3-year-old fish in our scale samples, we know fish are getting back up into the ponds, but something's happening on those fish's way out. And if we know we're always getting 3-year-old fish, we know the babies are getting out because they're coming back, but we know those adults are never leaving and then coming back again, because otherwise you'd get some 3-year-old fish, and then your age classes would sort of decline as you go along. So being able to tell something about the age structure tells us about it too, and that all goes into this, like I said, really high bar of 10 years of data that's needed to be able to help manage your fishery. And when you think about that, if there's anybody help out on lobster boats in the summer or do any fishing around here? Anyway, if you do think about it, or if you know anyone that's a commercial fisherman, a lot of people talk about access to the fishery and that's basically what it takes to get into it. Like, do you have to buy $1 million boat? Do you have to do this, whatever it is? And even though it's a bummer having to buy an expensive boat to lobster fish, or maybe be on a waiting list for several years, to be able to, this is basically like saying if you want to fish for lobster out in Penobscot Bay, you've got to collect the data to give us a population estimate of the entire working population that's out there for a decade, and then we'll let you start catching some fish. And so this bar is super high, and it's really conservative, and in the end, has a fishery that you can harvest pretty safely but is a huge bar to keep people volunteering. So these are just, we won't go through the actual data, but these are just some of the, just to kind of give you an idea. This is citizen science kind of collected, like community collected data that goes into this and kind of reworked by some fisheries biology people, but still it's the same stuff. And so you can see just, these are the basic numbers that go into it. These lines are different escapement goals that I don't know if I'll have time to go into too much, but there's a lot that goes into that. And then this right here is just an age class sort of graph that we were able to pull together and gives you a better idea of, like, so on the left side is just years, and then as you look across, you can see what came back that year. And then if you look sort of in the diagonal way and follow these colors, you can look at like a population, a cohort of fish that were all born the same year, and as they kind of come back, and just how this data feeds into how we manage the fishery, and just how impressive it is really that these communities are collecting this data to manage fisheries in this way that's really complex at any level. And aside from monitoring, a lot of it really was around local questions, and that's really something that's near and dear to me, is that the work that we're doing is practically useful. And I know the stuff that I see coming out of MMA classes, like what that Carrie and Sarah are doing with helping with us with zooplankton work, and Leanne's class work helping my shellfish committee in Brooklyn and others looking at sources for pollution. It's really about those practical things that, to me anyway, that really make this work like drive home and really connect to something. And so a lot of the other work that we did was just around collaborative questions that the people on the Alewife committees had. And so on the left you can see, that's actually Sarah and I and Bailey putting some pit tags, these little kind of 2 Tic Tacs in a row size fish tags, surgically putting them into some adult fish that were coming up to spawn when we were working with Maine Coast Heritage Trust on a restoration project. And this engineer was like, oh, these fish can't swim past this old barrier. And everybody in the town was like, yes, they can. And the engineer was like, well, on here it says that they can't. And so we put some tags in some fish, and then put a little detector of the tags that works like an easy pass, like when you go through, up above the barrier. And we were able to like put 100 or so tags down there and actually watch quite a few of them make it past the barrier, and it was ended up being able to like save the project to $500,000, and to me, like even cooler, like prove that this local knowledge is better than a graduate degree in engineering when you're talking about a certain stream and a certain fish. This picture in the middle is some of our beginning work that we copied from a UMass Amherst grad student that was starting to look at baby alewives and adult alewives and starting to compare productivity and things like that. And Ann will talk a little bit about that more, but that's us doing a purse seine for baby alewives in Walker Pond. And this over here is us doing a beach seine out in Northern Bay, looking for baby alewives again to help the town start sort of prioritizing areas of the Northern Bay to say, like, okay, we're okay with aquaculture over here, we're not okay with it here, because maybe that's a sanctuary for alewives because of eelgrass or whatever. And back to that, I'll zip through this because I know I'm going a little long, but this is that pygmy alewife. This is my kind of cartoon slide of this. So this is basically, like I said, they said these fish were little, and the town wanted to figure out what was going on, and he's like, what does that mean? Nobody knows what that means. And so what we were able to do is we were able to take that question, like, why can't we catch these fish anymore? I was able to sort of figure out why, in state statute they weren't allowed to do that, and what we could do to prove that these aren't some special fish. So we connected with a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who did genetic work and used to live in Maine. And so he did some genetic testing for us to show that they weren't any different genetically than any other alewife you might pull out of any other place. And then we collected some juvenile samples to look at their migration timings and how that fit into it. And so because of that, 3 years of doing that, we were able to get that fishery opened back up to non-commercial harvest and get people to at least, even if they're not going to choose to commercially harvest that fishery, to be able to, at least go out there and dip some fish in the spring. And then, there's the beaver in the room, and we talk about work to bring these back. Nothing really conjures that up to me more than a beaver slapping its tail in the water. And this is really what, to me, the other reason why the state would never be able to keep this going is the number, if there's a beaver that lives on a stream that these fish are having to come up, you can pretty much add a couple, at least 100 or 200 hours of community service work to be able to go in there. Someday, we even had a MMA intern one year whose only job was basically to be going around and notching beaver dams and taking them down as the fish are coming back, because it's really an almost everyday process. And so I can't express this enough just how much work and dedication really goes into this co-management on this side. And then of course there's the restoration piece that we partnered with Maine Coast Heritage Trust, where I work with now, on for those other two ponds, Frost Pond and Parker Pond, that I talked about in the beginning, that used to have fish. And so we were able to do a really cool thing, which is different from most places in the state, where they usually get their fish from one certain run that's easy to grab some fish in Augusta, and then they'll bring fish when they do stock them to restart a run. And so we were able to collect fish locally from Walker Pond to be able to stock into Parker's and Frost, and had 3 really fun years of toting fish around the peninsula for that. But the result was we've got fish are back in all the ponds in the Bagaduce River right now, and this is a picture of us stocking fish in all those ponds. And that's us getting them over a culvert before we replace them going up up Snows Brook into Frost Pond. And really it's about sustainability and thinking about the future, like I said, how we keep this going. So it's getting kids involved, it's really tying values to capacity and thinking about why we're doing this, what the reason is behind this. And this is a picture of the first, we've talked about 10 years. I also worked on kind of a policy level, and we were able to create a pilot program where some towns were able to harvest at around 6-7 years of data, and we're sort of able to gradually, in a graduated way, be able to go up to a harvest level as a way of really incentivizing all this work that goes into it. Like we talked about, you think about a commercial fishery, and that's probably going to be bad for a fish population, but really when it takes this annual work every single year and hundreds of hours in each of those years to keep fish coming back, commercial fisheries in a place where our cultural connection to our fisheries a lot of times is in the form of catching them and selling them, is really kind of a recipe for how we get people to be perpetually interested in keeping this resource going, whether it's going out and dipping 25 fish and smoking them at home, or having it be part of what goes into your lobster traps to be able to catch fish. And then one other really quick thing that we've also been working on with MMA and some other partners is working on a curriculum for local elementary and high school students. And this is something that Bailey really had kind of near and dear to his heart, and has been working with myself and Val Peacock at Rural Aspirations Project to really kind of create a curriculum that can, a lot of the work that we did with kids before we started this curriculum was just having like 1 or 2 field trips with each class out to a run to check them out in the spring and look at things like that, or do fish printing. And this is just a way of trying to make that a little bit more formal and really create the stewards of the next generation. So what we did was we basically picked Bailey's brain and said, what did you have to learn over the past 10, 15, 20 years, your whole life, whatever you want to put it in there, and how do we jam the important stuff like that into something that can be accessible for kids in a local kind of place-based way. And so this is something that's only a couple years old, and we're really just starting to get off the ground, but it's a really cool way of moving this forward. And speaking of moving forward, that's where I think a lot of this sort of spun into work with other partners like Manomet into what we call is, basically started on a canoe trip where I was working with a predecessor of Ann's, another Ann, who was collecting some DNA samples with me, and we were just talking about all these people, that are so passionate about these fish in this world and like really connecting them, and that's where this idea of a river herring network came up, and really only could work with partners. And so I'm going to let Ann talk about where that's gone.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah. Oh, hang on over here.
Do-si-do here. All right, so just quick about me. Mike did it, I get to do it. My name is Ann Segers. I have been involved in fisheries conservation here in Down East Maine since the early 2000s, first as kind of a tag-along and then a volunteer with the Down East Salmon Federation. And then I got back into it as an adult in 2018 when I was attending a local high school concert of all things, and one of the fisheries biologists for the Atlantic salmon program that the Department of Marine Resources runs was complaining that they couldn't get anyone to apply for their seasonal fisheries tech position. Go to those local community events. My entire thought process for this was, I'm an idiot who can lift 50 pounds. Oh, yep, that's proof. That didn't get me that job, shockingly. It did get me a job with Project Share, and that is Salmon Habitat River. I wrote it down. I worked there for 6 years. Salmon Habitat and River Enhancement, doing large woody debris installations in rivers to try to simulate what they might have looked like before they were cleaned out during the log drives. So that was with these post-assisted log structures, and also using a big winch to winch trees down into the river. A lot of fun. And then that job did lead back to that DMR seasonal tech position. So doing assessments of numbers of fish, doing red counting, that's what we're doing in the polling video there, adding salmon roe to artificial nests in the winter, and then checking their adult trap on the Narraguagus River in Cherryfield. Unfortunately, that is not a salmon in that last photo there. That is an American shad, which are still very pretty. And then in 2024, I took this job with Manomet as their Sea Run Fisheries Monitoring Coordinator, and one of the two co-coordinators of the Gulf of Maine River Herring Network. So a tiny little bit about Manomet real fast. Most of Manomet is a bird conservation organization headquartered in Plymouth, but there are 4 of us in Maine who work in fisheries, and all of our fisheries work is in the Gulf of Maine. We're looking at coastal ecosystems, aquaculture, emerging and climate resilient fisheries, and river herring really got to be on our radar as a re-emerging fishery, as a fishery that, as Mike talked about, was once historically very important to the Maine economy, that declined and is now experiencing a little bit of a rebound. So the River Herring Network, Mike sort of talked about the genesis of this, and I'm not going to reiterate that, but we have a couple main goals. Right, so there's a ton of different people working in fish. Mike talked about everyone who's working with river herring on the Bagaduce. The Bagaduce is sort of a microcosm of what's happening all across the state. There's hundreds of little Bagaduces everywhere. So all these people, though, were kind of working in their own silos. So Mike and Ann Hayden's idea was that it would be great to bring people together so that they could start to talk to each other and help each other. So building relationships and trust, conducting research together. How can we, across the state, be more effective and work together? And then how can we be more effective in advocating for fish and sustainable fisheries and co-management? So these are sort of what the River Herring Network was founded to achieve. We also meet in person, which is very exciting because this was started during COVID, so meeting in person, woo! This was at a research symposium that we put on in January of this year, and we actually had a couple of MMA students present at that, which was fantastic. You'll hear more about their work in a few slides. So the network's interests are really driven by what the members are interested in, and as we met together and started talking, a few things sort of shook out and rose to the surface. So how many fish are there? When are they showing up? What is driving river herring production in the spawning habitat? What environmental factors are potentially affecting migration? And what is the role that stewardship plays in sustainability? So for most of these, the River Herring Network has developed sustainable monitoring protocols that are available and simple and hopefully standardized enough that stewards from within the network can apply them on their runs all across the state of Maine, and we get data back that is hopefully consistent enough to do a little cross-run analysis on. So we have a few current community science projects. Temperature loggers, we currently have 24 temperature loggers deployed in 15 runs from, I think, Westbrook in the greater Portland area is our furthest south and west, up to Danforth in extreme northern Washington County. And we are interested in, the data for these, by the way, is all available in the Northeast Stream Temperature database. So if any of you need to do climate modeling for any reason, we got you covered. And we're interested in understanding how temperature affects run migration timing and potentially how it affects other environmental factors that may play a role in run migration timing, such as zooplankton, as Mike said. Thank you, sir. As Mike said, zooplankton are the food for river herring when they are resident in the spawning habitat. So since 2023, we have been doing zooplankton sampling at several spawning sites around Maine, mostly in Hancock and Washington County. And what we are interested in is how do the populations of zooplankton change as juvenile river herring are resident in these spawning habitats. So we actually ran a workshop on how to make your very own zooplankton dip net out of pantyhose if you can't get one of the nice ones. But we we're going out and collecting water samples about once a month, and then bringing them back here to Maine Maritime Academy. And Callista Reese and Maya Jones, I believe they both have graduated now. They were great. But during their plankton ecology and education project, they developed a protocol to use your flow cam to quantify the number and type of zooplankton that were in each sample. So big thanks to them, and hopefully we're going to see a little bit of that work carry on into next semester. So running out of food in the lake is potentially one of the main drivers of juvenile herring migration. We want to know when are they leaving and how big they are when they are leaving. No one is trying to count these guys. That way lies madness. There are just too many of them exiting spawning habitat to even go there. But we do want to know how big they are when they emigrate and how old they are when they emigrate. So we have a project running in collaboration with Karen Wilson's lab at the University of Southern Maine, and they are aging fish for us using otoliths. And did you talk about otoliths? I don't think you did. So do we know otoliths? We know otoliths, cool. They are pulling the otoliths out and they are examining them to determine age at emigration and growth rate. So we can combine these factors with how large they are at emigration to figure out how well they're growing in the spawning habitat and how old they are when they leave. And how old they are when they leave is becoming kind of an emerging problem. I don't know if you noticed this summer and fall, it was quite dry. And the same thing happened last year. So an emerging question is, what happens to these fish if they can't get out to sea? What does that do to them if they're stuck and forced to overwinter in the spawning habitat? So this is something that we're looking at. We don't have anything fun to share yet because this is just very new. But that is a direction that research is going in, and we'll be very interested to see in 3-4 years' time what kind of signal these last 2 falls of drought has in the adult counts, which brings us, of course, to adult counts. This is kind of the most basic type of monitoring that you can do on a river herring run. There are a ton of ways that people in the network are counting. As Mike said, some of them are standing over the stream with a little clicker counter and doing that for half an hour at a time, 4 times a day. There's also people who are netting them out of traps and who have video cameras or electric resistance counters. There's a ton of ways to count these things. And this is happening, again, not just in Maine, but all the way up and down the Atlantic coast. So the River Herring Network partnered with a couple of College of the Atlantic students to create an open access count dashboard. And we are currently on this page displaying some counts from your area here in the Castine area. But we have counts from Maryland and Pennsylvania, and we're going to have very soon as I do the actual uploading, some counts from New Hampshire in addition to counts from Maine. So we can see annual counts over time. This is from 2010 to 2024. We can also look at, within one count year, how are fish arriving day to day? Where are the peaks of the run? Is it one peak or is it a bimodal distribution with several peaks? We can also look at when the runs start and end. And going back to temperature, is that changing as springs get warmer? So this is all available online. And then finally, we are working again with College of the Atlantic and Colby College on a project on the value of stewardship. Mike talked about the hundreds of hours that go into clearing beaver dams, clearing fish passage. And again, that is happening all over the state, and it is wildly underappreciated. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Sarah. So we have a hypothesis, right, that runs that have active stewardship are going to be more sustainable long-term. We would like to actually get some data to support that. So our intern from College of the Atlantic last year did hours and hours of interviews with stewards asking, what motivates you to steward this run? What makes you put in these often unpaid hours standing in the black flies and the rain to do this? And so these are just some of the answers that we got from some of the stewards. Come on, clicker. And we also talked to commercial harvesters because they do have a financial incentive to steward these runs. And they said shockingly similar things to some of our unpaid stewards. Oh, I got to point it at the computer. Well, that would, thank you, Michael.
I think it helps.
So these are just some of the hours that were reported to us. You can tell that there is a ton of time being put into these projects. For example, like repairing fishways and ladders, the amount of times, like someone's doing that more than 30 times a year. That's insane. So this is going to be coming out as a paper hopefully soon. And we are looking forward to sharing that information with everyone in greater detail. But in the meantime, if you guys are at all interested in counting river herring, you can, of course, talk to Mike about working in this local area. You can go to the DMR website and actually count fish. Helps again if you have little clicker counter. You can help count the 2023 run from the Pennamaquan River up in Pembroke. You can also go, we don't have links to this, but there are runs in Massachusetts that you can count. And I believe we may have, hopefully, opportunities in the summer to do a little bit of work again in this area. We're working on that. And now I think we have a few minutes left for questions.
We don't have a ton of time, but if there's a quick question somebody has, we could ask. And then I know Ann and Mike are available to chat afterwards too. So, question. All right. Hold on.
Hello. I'm curious to understand if you know how rainfall patterns increase or decrease via population of river herring.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, and something that we were really seeing this spring. I know I said summer and fall were really dry. If you remember way back in the midst of time, this spring was really wet. So we were actually seeing some interesting patterns happening at different runs. There were a few runs like, I believe the Somesville run in Mount Desert Island. They had one of their best runs ever. And then at other runs, like the Pemaquan River that I was just talking about, they had so much water coming out that fish were having a hard time actually making it up the fish ladder, like trying to swim up a fire hose. So I don't know that anyone has studied the impact on spawners in depth, but it's certainly something that's worth looking into. There are some folks in Massachusetts who are currently studying the lack of rainfall and the effect that that's having on juveniles emigrating out in the fall. So thank you.
Yeah. I think that's probably all we have time for, but
It was a good
And it was a
question.
good
though.
it was a great question. Thank you, Jacob. And I just reiterate, they're very accessible. Please reach out if you have questions. Thank you so much. And thank you to our guests.